Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Thriving Adoptees podcast. So I was just saying to our guest today, Ron Levi, that we've had too many women on the show. So it's good to have a bloke. Good to have a bloke on the show after a while. So welcome to the show, Ron. Looking forward to our chat today.
Thank you. Thank you for asking or for inviting me. It's great to be here. I appreciate the opportunity to talk with you about something that's important to both of us and obviously many others.
Yeah. So Ron's just in case, like you haven't noticed, listeners, pretty much all the episodes now are fellow adoptees. I've done a lot in the past that had a lot of adopted parents on. Just decided to focus in, narrow the focus to adoptees. So Ron's a fellow adoptee. He's an author as well, and something that when I reread his the blurb for his book this morning, I thought would be a great way to kick off the conversation, because it's so eloquently put and such some big themes. So I'm just going to read you the last sentence, and then we'll dive into the conversation. So Ron's book, he goes as Ronald G. Levi Jr. on his Amazon profile. So links as always in the show notes. So the book's called Spitting Image, and Spitting Image here in the UK is a show, a satirical news show. But Spitting Image is also the title of Ron's book, and it's a sweeping adventure of American courage, perseverance, and faith, culminating in acceptance, gratitude, and personal transformation. So some big themes there, Ron, and the one that particularly intrigues me to dive into is the personal transformation piece, because Thriving Adoptees is all about learning. So you said before we started recording, that the personal transformation is still your personal transformation is still ongoing, and I guess what do people say? Change is the only constant. So yeah, why did you pick that word, personal transformation?
Well, I really feel that I became a different person, in my attitudes about myself, about race, about society and culture were heavily affected and changed as a result of the discoveries of my research and of writing this book. Right? So in addition to doing the research and finding out the facts of my genetic identity, I also came to terms, or face to face, with a lot of preconceptions and misconceptions I may have had about American history, about race, about myself. And I continue to evolve in that way. But it definitely changed my mind about some of the things that I thought previously.
Yeah. Can you give us a snapshot or an example of something to bring that big picture into focus with a little example?
Sure. Well, I was born in 1964, so this is the civil rights era in the United States, on the tail end of Jim Crow, when many African Americans were leaving the South in agrarian, systems, low-paying subsistence farming or sharecropping, moving to the North for industrial, much better paying jobs, right? And my mother and her father, my grandfather, were two of those who came from Mississippi to Detroit to have a better life, right? And so my youth in Detroit, although I was born and raised in Detroit, was heavily influenced by their experiences in the South as well, their biases, their opinions, right? And so the way that we were treated and the way that we saw the world was probably, I would say, somewhat suspicious, right? Through redlining, and rightly so. I mean, because African Americans in the North brought with them all these experiences of discrimination, hatred, violence from the South. And so they were rightly suspicious to be just as a matter of self-preservation, right? And so when you're raised in that environment, or at least I'll speak for myself, growing up in that environment, I can say that I always thought of myself purely as an African American male. inside and out, 100%. Although in the mirror, I could see the lightness of my skin, that I wasn't purely African, obviously, as really no African American is, that we all have, have some genetic inheritance from European or other nationalities. But I identified as Black or African American, and felt that way throughout my entire youth. So then, although I knew it, I didn't really come to terms with it until I discovered the actual ethnic mix of my heritage through DNA and genetic testing. And I discovered that I wasn't half. Now, I always assumed my mother was white and my father was Black. And, so one would, say that's 50-50, right? It didn't occur to me that my father was also biracial, or may have been biracial, making my ethnic mix only 28% Black and 72% white, right? And and so when you grow up as a Black child in Detroit who's light skinned, you kind of catch it from both ends, right? The Black kids say, they call you, yellow kid or white kid. And the white kids, call you Black or other or worse, worse names, of course.
Yeah.
And so you kind of catch it from both sides. But I always identified as Black. Well, now after discovering, I got a speeding ticket in my early days of driving. And on the speeding ticket, the officer, when they identify you, wrote white, right? And I was indignant, as a young Black man. I said, his powers of observation are obviously in question if he can't tell that I'm clearly a Black man, right? Right. But now, 20 years after that, seeing the genetic mix, he probably had better powers of observation than I did of myself, because in fact, genetically, I'm 72% European, in fact, Slovakian and German. So that was all part of that transformation. And then coming to grips with how people see us and how we interpret that, and reconciling it with how we see ourselves as a part of this transformation, right? We assume sometimes if we don't get an opportunity, or if we are denied service, or feel that we are unfairly treated, as African Americans, it's natural to question, is the reason for that because of the color of our skin, given the history in the United States and given what we've been through, right? It's one of the first things you think of, but it's never the only thing. It's never the only reason. Sometimes it's because of our own behavior that we're treated in certain ways, no matter what the color of our skin is, whether we're white, Black, Asian, or anything else, right? But really, until I went through this experience, I never gave it that much thought. Right. So part of this transformation is really understanding how much of what we do we bring upon ourselves, and how much of what we do is because of others' biases, and how much of it is because of our own biases. And it's all just a big mixture of all those things. Right. So it comes with a measure of being forgiving of oneself as well as being forgiving of others, in order for us to move through life, I think, with more grace, more effectively, at greater peace.
Yeah. Peace, yeah, we're all looking for that. We're all looking at that for that, my friend. So as I was saying before we came on the started recording, I've just come back from the Caribbean, and as I left the airport, there's a sign there that we've been a few times, and I'm sure this poster's been there all the time, what they were saying. And it showed what is called in Barbados a chattel house. So it's a house that it's a house kit from the 19th century apparently, and the emancipated slaves built these houses, and they could move them. So it's like a wooden. Yeah, a wooden structure, and it said that the slaves in Barbados were emancipated in 1834, and I was thinking that seems a long time. That seems a very long time ago. Can you give us some background in terms of what laws in the US? When did?
Well, if I can recall, I believe, Great Britain outlawed slavery in about that time, about 1834, which is why they probably said Barbados as an English colony,
Yeah.
Was emancipated at that time. But the concept of emancipation, I think, is very different from the reality of it, right? People may be said to be free, but they're not. They weren't really free to do as they please. They didn't have the wherewithal, the resources, natural or otherwise, to be completely free. In the United States, of course, I think the importation of slaves, the slave trade, that is the bringing in of slaves from outside the U.S., I believe was outlawed around that time. I don't remember the exact date. But of course, the slave trade within the United States continued until the Civil War ended it in 1864. Right. Okay. And then after 1864, although the concept of emancipation and the amendments to the Constitution made freedom a word that we should all rely on, there was Jim Crow, right? And there were those in the United States who weren't ready to cede power of any kind or really provide equality of any kind. And we entered this era of Reconstruction in which essentially African Americans were still in a system of slavery well into the 1880s and into the 1990s.
Wow. And I guess this, for me, this, people might be wondering why I'm asking all this. I think for me, it's because of a lot of stuff that I've read about, I think it's called intergenerational trauma. So the trauma is passed on. And the guy that I was listening to was talking about it from a Jewish perspective, right? But it must be the same for any group such as slaves and African Americans, or here in the UK, people that have come, perhaps they came over with what's called the Windrush generation. So when Britain started encouraging people that had the offspring of and what do they call them? The descendants of people of slaves that went west, to bring them back east to work in our equivalent of Detroit, which is Birmingham, where a lot of the car manufacturing was built. Like obviously in Detroit is Motown. So this intergenerational trauma that's passed on sits on top of did a podcast this morning with a Russian adoptee. So we talked about the different layers of trauma, and she came up with this metaphor of a sandwich. So you've got the primal wound, we've got abuse and neglect that may happen within the biological family before adoption. The same thing, any neglect that goes on in the adoptive family. We've got the transracial piece, we've got the transcultural piece, and then we could add on top of that the kind of generational trauma, and all this stuff is building up and adding to the, I don't know what you would call it, the emotional backpack the backpack of trauma that different groups of people are traveling around with. And as a white guy adopted by white parents, I don't have any of that, so I don't understand. I have no lived experience of that. So that's why I think it's important to understand all this as factors in the mix of the trauma piece.
Right. Well, I really like the phrase you termed there, the backpack of trauma. I think we all probably do have our own backpack of trauma, whether we're white or black, and maybe our backpacks contain different traumas, but they're trauma for us nonetheless. I mean, just the fact of being adopted, one wonders, about one's origins. Why was one adopted? What were the reasons and circumstances? Wasn't I good enough? What was it about me that caused my mother to give me away? Right? Was it my fault? Was I not lovable enough? And that's universal, regardless of race and color, right? And I think some people get over that very quickly, and some attribute their ability to rise above that to the love they receive from their adopted family, right? I was raised in a warm, loving family. I knew that I was adopted, but I never really felt the need or desire we hear sometimes to go find out about my genetic family, because I was very comfortable and loved in my own adopted family. But that doesn't mean the trauma doesn't exist. And that doesn't mean they don't have a backpack, right? They've still got a little backpack, and it may not weigh them down always, but sometimes at night when they're asleep or when they look at their kids, they might wonder, there's something about my kids I just don't know because I don't know my own genetic identity. That was the case for me, right? So even though my mom loved me very much, and I came from a family that took great care of me and loved me and provided everything I needed, once I was married and had children, I couldn't help but wonder when we go to the doctor, for instance, when we adoptees go to the doctor and the doctor asks about medical history, we're limited. We only know what we know about ourselves. We can't say if there's a history of some, disease or something in our families, right? And that's okay. I could deal with that as long as it was me. But now when it came time for my children to not have that answer, I wasn't okay with that, right? And I wanted to be able to find out about my genetic history, my biological mother and father's medical history, so that I could at least give that to my own children so they would grow up knowing. So little things like that. So that's all part of the trauma. That's all. So it's not about anger and resentment all the time. Sometimes it's just about not knowing the things that so many of us take for granted. If you're born with it and you know it, it's not traumatic. But I think there are probably also things that cause us each a little bit of trauma, especially for adoptees. And at the very least, it's closure. At the very least, if you had a fantastic experience, God bless the child that has his own, but if you've had a fantastic experience, you don't have any interest in finding other family, sometimes you still just would like to know that closure. And it may not be top of mind, it may not be the most important thing in the world, but you kind of still want a little bit of closure at least. It would be nice to know, bare minimum.
Yeah. So another thing that you said when we spoke last time is this, and I loved it, the fact that love is the way. So can you give us a bit of context to around that? Because I feel like I just threw it in. So what's the context of that, and what does it mean to you, Ron?
Well, when I look back at the experiences and the, we trudge uphill sometimes. Sometimes we get to coast downhill a little bit. And it was always at the top of that hill, coasting down, where I had overcome something, and it was a result of love that allowed me to overcome that something. Okay. For me, I felt that love from my mother, from my grandfather, who was a Baptist minister, and from my own personal faith and relationship with God. I felt loved and protected, even though sometimes I couldn't explain it or where it was coming from. I always felt someone was on my side. Someone was looking over my shoulder. It doesn't mean that I never experienced difficulties. I did, right? But love was always the way for me. And even in finding out, some of the uncomfortable truths, like learning that my second great grandfather owned my second great grandmother, right? And that I was the second great grandchild of a Confederate sympathizer, that was hard to accept at first. And when I went to the door of the home that still stands in Dublin, Georgia, and the Greek revival columns were there on the front porch and the white balcony. I mean, something out of a movie, right? I noticed physiological changes. I mean, I was sweating, I was perspiring, my heart rate was up. I was worried. I didn't know these people. I didn't call ahead and tell them I was coming. Here I am coming up the driveway of a place in my mother's experience where people could be shot. But now this is 2015. So my head was telling me, they're not going to shoot you. but my experience was telling me, you have no business here. You know, you don't know these people, you're not welcome, right?
Yeah.
But again, love, right? And expecting to be loved, expecting that love was a way, I was able to move through that. And I was able to say, you know, this family who experienced so much trauma, my grandmother, the child of that second great grandfather and second great grandmother, she, although born into slavery, named her first son after her half white brother, who also owned her, essentially, right? So this issue that we always think of, I'm not saying in any way that slavery was good or that there are good things to be found in slavery. What I'm saying is it's very complicated, and that love is persistent, and that love takes on many forms, and love is our salvation in every instance. That's what I'm saying. Okay, right? So somehow she got through that. Somehow she loved her mother loved her, she loved her children. Somehow these relationships were more complicated than we can even imagine. And we can only reconcile, we can only get through them through forgiveness. And you can't forgive if you can't love. In my opinion, is the only way to forgive is to love yourself, because sometimes we don't realize it, but we hold on to these things which are very powerful. This baggage that we talked about, this trauma in the backpack, it weighs us down. And the only way to open up that backpack and unload that weight, unload that trauma, is to forgive. If we don't love ourselves enough to forgive, the trauma will continue to drag us down and slow us down. So sometimes we think, well, I can't forgive that person because what they did was so terrible, right? That's not the reason to forgive. The reason to forgive is because I love myself enough to move forward. I love myself enough, and I am loved enough, and I am worthy enough that I shouldn't be weighed down by those things.
Yeah.
So we have to unpack the trauma. The only way to unpack the trauma is to forgive. Even if the person we're forgiving never knows we forgave them, we know.
Yeah.
So it starts with love, and love is the way.
Yeah. Wow, there's a lot of power there. I've talked about this a few times. Do you on the podcast, and I think it's a great story. Do you ever remember an American guy called Wayne Dyer? Did you hear it?
Yes, Dr. Wayne Dyer, but I can't remember the context.
Yeah.
Next, wait,
He was I guess a self-development, personal development, kind of spiritual author guy, one of the early people in this space in the 60s and the 70s, 80s. I think he died, I don't know, maybe 5-6 years ago now. But he tells this story on a PBS show, I think it was, of, so he was part of a big family, and they're out. I think that his father was an alcoholic, but his father left him and his siblings and his mum to fend for themselves. And Wayne Dyer carried that trauma, that backpack, and resentment towards his father for decades. And by a strange series of events, he ended up at his father's grave side. And he went there, and he intended to actually pee on his father's grave. Right? He ranted and raved at his father's grave for a couple of hours. And then he had a spontaneous forgiveness. And he says that, using the language we've been talking, that took the backpack of trauma, of resentment, fell off his shoulders. And he reckons that him and the work that he wanted to do in the world soared after that moment. And when I see when I see anybody holding a grudge, especially adoptees, holding a grudge towards somebody, so it could be the birth parents, it could be the adopted parents. I always think of that story, and it really sums up for me what you just said in the, we can have a really good reason to hold a grudge. But
I appreciate that story so much. I'll tell you, coincidentally, I just recalled where I know Wayne Dyer. Wayne Dyer is also from Detroit.
Oh, wow, of course, yeah.
Yeah, he was born and raised in Detroit, and he went to the same university I went to. I went to Wayne State University, and he went to Wayne State University. But the story about him wanting to pee on his father's grave. Now, can you imagine me standing at the graves of my second great grandfathers who were slave owners, who impregnated my second great grandmothers in Dublin, Georgia? What I must have been thinking. It occurred to me. Let's put it like that. I didn't do it, but but it definitely occurred to me. But but he's right though. It really sets you free. It's not the truth that sets you free. It's love and forgiveness, especially love of oneself. And it's a tough thing to love oneself that much, right? Especially when you've been given away, right? Resenting. I resented my mother once, my biological mother once. As I said, I had mostly a happy, youth and family in Detroit. Although we had some tough times with my adopted father. Right? My mother was just a saint, and my father's family and parents and cousins were all fantastic too. But we had some tough times, and there were some really difficult times when I thought to myself, if my birth mother hadn't given me up, my life would have been so much better. But I discovered again through the research, her life was no bed of roses. She had a really, really difficult time, and I really kind of believe now that if she hadn't given me up, she and I both might have been, killed. We might not have made it as far as we did. So there really is a reason. So this goes back to where I said, even when I didn't know where it was coming from, I felt that someone was on my side, watching over me and taking care of me, and I'm sure that was the case. So, when I realized that, it was so much easier. I really didn't have to forgive her that much because, those feelings of resentment and wanting to know that, why did she give me up? Those were episodic for me. I didn't carry those with me every day, throughout my life. Only in a couple of bad times did I think those things,
Yeah.
But yeah, it's important to be able to let them go, however you do that.
It's very interesting for me, the fact that I've never heard anybody's experience in that regard match my own so clearly.
Really?
I think it sounds like your adopted dad gave you a trickier character than mine, for example. But in terms of the feelings of, you said that on a couple of occasions when you were in a tough spot, you had some resentment towards your birth mother. I would say I had once I had some anger towards her, and then another, and on a second occasion, I was terrified of her rejecting me again. But those two moments really stand out because we're talking about 40 seconds, two 20-second bursts. Like I'm 3 years younger than you, so I've now been on the planet, what is it, 56 years, and in that time I've had 40 seconds of anger or resentment towards my birth mother. So 40 seconds, but they really stand out. They really stand out. And I was just flicking through my notes in terms of the religious stuff and the anger, that because I was talking to my mentor yesterday, and she reminded me of two things that are pertinent to our conversation today. One thing, apparently the Buddha said that there's no justifiable anger. No justifiable anger. I thought that was really, I think that was really cool. And another thing she said is a quote that she shared with me a lot of time, an Einstein quote, which goes something like, the biggest question we can ever ask ourselves is the world for me or against me? And you've talked a couple of times of perhaps your faith and other things in your world. You have felt that the world has been on your side. That would be. So you said something guiding you, something, but it's some kind of advice.
Yeah, I would say it differently. Let me clarify that.
Yeah.
The world has never been on my side, especially as a Black male, born when I was born. The world has always been determined to kill me off from the very first moment. It's God who has been on my side.
Okay, sorry.
Right? It is the creator of the universe. It is love personified. It is the embodiment of peace and love that has always been with me. Even before I knew what it was or who it was, it's always been there. And it's been the thing that has done battle against the world on my behalf.
Wow.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I'm feeling pretty stupid now. Sorry.
Oh no, I don't mean that's the last thing I want you to feel.
Yeah, cool.
But no, I mean, from a faith perspective, often I don't know if it's a Protestant thing or if it's a Catholic thing, but we often make a big distinction between being in the world and being of the world. Okay. We are born into the world, but through faith we separate from it, right? In the way that we think, in the way that we act and respond, we hope through the grace of God we can change the world, right? Because the world needs changing. The world is inhospitable to us, right? So we want to change it and impose love upon the world to make it better.
Yeah. So as you say this, I'm thinking that I remembered the quote, the Einstein quote, wrongly, or I've not, or I think he said the universe. So by the universe, he probably meant God, rather than the world as the physical world. I think that's what he said. So
the universe is for him.
Maybe I should, maybe I should check my quotes before I toss them out there in a conversation.
Quite all right. I didn't really mean so much to correct you. I apologize, but I just wanted to be clear to those who know me and who listen to me what I mean.
I think it's a great distinction. I think it's a great distinction. So we stumbled into it, but it's a great distinction. The other thing, I guess, is that the change starts from within, to talking, from a personal transformation point of view. So it's looking within rather than without first, is that?
I think so. Sometimes there are triggers, though, of course, right? There are trigger events that may spark that change from within. But I agree, it does. They say people only change when they want to change, right?
Yeah.
And so it does sometimes require a spark or something, some event, some external event to wake us up and to realize, that we want something different, that we want to change.
Yeah. That's a whole, that I could take us down that rabbit hole. But I want to bring it back to you and your story. So could you give us some we started off with this personal transformation idea off the back of the blurb from your book. What would you say would be the most significant points in that change? You talked about facing those Neo-Greek columns and stuff like that, and as you said that, I thought maybe that's the generational trauma thing surfacing. You know, as what's he said, the guy Bessel van der Kolk says, you know, the body keeps the score. So was that a transformational moment for you? Did that, when you became aware of that, those sensations within your body?
It's hard to pin it down to one moment. I would certainly say that on that trip to Georgia, that the trip in itself was certainly that moment, right? Being on the steps wasn't so much the moment, but the next day or the day after, actually, the home was for sale at that time. And one of my cousins was a real estate agent who secured, you know, a tour of the home for us. We were able to go in, and being in the home where they walked and worked, and being on those grounds, looking out the window through the glass that they might have looked out through, or probably replacing it, but still, almost being in their shoes, almost, you know, was definitely a transformative moment for me, and how I viewed them all, and how I appreciated how complex their lives were. They weren't the simple, you know, that's a terrible word, but they weren't the black and white stories that we see, you know, in the movies and on television so often. They were extremely complex people at very complex times, dealing with the hands that they were each dealt. Another time I think that were transformative moments, just maybe they were just memorable more than they were transformative. But the first time I touched my cousin Frances's hand, so Frances is on my paternal side, and because of all of the research she did before I met her, we realized our DNA match, and we were both interested in finding out why. She's a great researcher, and because of the work she had done, I was able to sort of fast forward into my paternal family. It would have taken me years otherwise, but because she had laid the trail already, it was really became more of a matter of connecting a few distant dots than starting from scratch, right? But meeting her for the first time and holding her hand, that was the first time I had ever held the hand of a person to whom I was genetically related. And just touching her skin and seeing her hand and holding her hand was very impactful to me. Another time we met at the home of one of our cousins. There were probably 10 of us cousins who met there, and Frances brought the family Bible with her. That was my great grandmother's Bible, the one who was born in 1847 into slavery. Yeah. She had this Bible, and they had handwritten the names of children and marriages and deaths. And opening those pages of a book that was, you know, that was used in the 1870s with my relatives' hands on them that had caressed the pages and turned the pages and written. That was a very impactful moment for me. And then the third was meeting my maternal sister for the first time. Realizing that I had a sister was crazy to begin with, but and finding out that we were so different. She with blonde hair and blue eyes, and you know, and it was just it was surreal. If not transformation, it was certainly surreal.
Yeah. You've talked about loving yourself and loving ourselves. It's such a big theme. Were there any tipping points on that when that became clear to you, or is that just always been with you?
No, I think it's always a challenge. You know, I could be hard on myself, as probably many of us can. You know, it's easy to doubt yourself and to think you're not good enough. And it's not necessarily because of adoption, you know, or anything like that. Sometimes, you know, as I said, the world just is an inhospitable place, and we all have road to hoe, as it were. We all have a mountain to climb. And sometimes I wonder if I'm up to the task, and I just remind myself that I've been loved, and I am loved, and I can love, and it's going to be okay. Right? So from a transformational standpoint, if anything, I would say it's more of a go-to position, a first stop than it ever was before. Before I could struggle with something and then eventually come back to that place where I was reminded it's going to be okay and I'm loved.
Yeah.
Right. Whereas now it's the first place I go. Right?
Does your faith play a role in that?
Absolutely plays a role in that. I think my faith has taught me and continues to teach me how to love and what love is. The unselfishness of it, the role of forgiveness in love, and the power of love, the selflessness of love, right? The altruism of it, worrying about others and not worrying about so much about myself. These are all tenets of my faith, Christianity. These are all tenets of my faith that are just part of who I am now. That doesn't mean that I never forget any of them or I do them out of order. I'm a work in progress, I guess is what I'm saying. But no, my point is, I don't think I would know how to love were it not for that. And I'm not sure how to describe love in absence of my faith. I don't have a way to do that.
Yeah.
So love is faith. It plays such a big part in who I am and how I perceive those things, and I'm growing in that, and I have been, since I was young, since I was a child. I've been growing in that faith and learning it, and it's been teaching me and molding me and and guiding me.
Yeah. And
sometimes I put it on the side though. Sometimes I put my faith down. I try not to these days now that I'm a little bit older. But there were many times in my life when I'd set it down, and kind of forget about it for a while. And then when things got really tough, I'd remember, oh, maybe I'll pick that back up again and dust that off and see how it's supposed to work, talk to somebody and see how it works for them. But now it's more of a regular thing for me, regular practice.
Yeah. And what's the kind of the interplay between love, faith, and trauma? How do those things, do they fit together? How does that sound?
So we can be confused to think that, if we are loved and if we are protected, we will not experience trauma. Right? If God loved me, I wouldn't experience trauma. If God loved me, I wouldn't have gone through that. If God loved me, I would have been spared. Right? That is the thinking of an immature me. Okay? But my experiences now have taught me, I've gone through so many things where I thought God was not there, and where I thought I was on my own, only to realize later that I could never have gotten through those things on my own, that I didn't get through them on my own, yet I got through them anyway. Right? And all of those pieces that had to be put into place in order for me to succeed or overcome were not in my control. Maybe one or two of them were, but so many others weren't. And I had no ability to influence those things, yet they all happened in concert for my good, for my benefit. Right? So those things have continued to happen throughout my life. And I guess that you could say that they've been the things that have strengthened my faith, because they've repeated and I've seen them happen again. So, or, you could say I just attribute them to that. And for that reason, I'm strong. But did I answer your question? Now you got me thinking.
I don't think so. I think it was a tricky question, I think, really. You answered it.
Let me see if I can do better.
You gave the fact that
So trauma. So right. So how do trauma and love and forgiveness?
Yeah, what's the interplay between those?
Okay, so I gave you the one example. We think that we're not going to go through these things, but faith has taught me through the examples that I tried to allude to there that it doesn't mean that we're not going to go through those things. It means that we're not going to go through them alone and that we will come out on the other side, right? Someone once said to me, it was very true, God can deliver from, God can also deliver in and through, right? It doesn't mean that you won't go through something, but it means that you won't go through it alone and that you will come out on the other end okay. Okay, so that's how faith and trauma work for me. It doesn't mean I won't go through trauma. It just means that when I'm in trauma, when I'm experiencing trauma, when trauma has my backpack heavy, right? I'm not the only one carrying it. Someone else is carrying that trauma with me and knows me and knows what the trauma is and will lighten that load.
So
we'll lighten that load through friendships. We'll lighten that load through loved ones. We'll lighten that load through laughter or music or diversions, right? There's always someone on my side, I believe, sent by God to help me through all of this. Not that he's going to take me around it, that I'll escape it all.
So we've got I like this. It's a bit cheesy, but I've started, so I'll finish. We've all got the trauma backpack, but God's got our back.
I like it. I like it. You remember, you know how, I don't know if you had this experience, but when we were kids, our backpacks were so heavy with books when we were going to school. And in the snow in Detroit, it would snow. And sometimes, someone would, push, another kid down, right? And the kid would be on his back with his heavy backpack, unable to get up. And it reminds me of how heavy our load can be sometimes. It makes it difficult to get up and move forward.
Yeah.
Right? But then one of us would help him up. Okay, we'd laugh, it'd be funny. We'd pick him up, he'd stand back up with his backpack still on, and we just keep on heading to school.
Yeah.
Kind of like that. There's I think God sends, it's not like, an invisible hand reaches out of the clouds and plucks us up and sets us right. It's not like that. But the resources are brought to bear, right, to help us continue to move forward.
Yeah.
That's how I'd say it.
That's the thing, yeah. So have you heard of a rig welter? Do you know what a rig welter is?
A rig router.
Rig welter. Welter. RIGGWELTER.
No, I have not.
I didn't think you would have done. So there was a family brewery here in the UK called Theakston, TR Theakston and Sons, and it grew into a big concern, and then the family sold out to an even larger concern, because there's lots of what do they call it? Conglomeration. What do they call it? Consolidation. There's consolidation within the brewery industry, right? Mm-hmm. So the one of the sons of the current generation, so he'd be probably our age, he didn't like it, and so he didn't like working he didn't want to work for a big conglomerate brewer. He set up on his own, and so he was the black sheep of the family, okay? Mm-hmm. And he set up his own brewery, and it's called Black Sheep, named after the fact it's Black Sheep. And their strongest beer is called Rigwelter, and so it's like 6% or 5.5%. For an ale, that's quite strong. And it's because a Rigwelter is a sheep that once it's fallen on its back, can't get back up.
I didn't know there was such a thing.
Yeah.
Wow.
So when you were talking about the kid with the backpack that couldn't get up because of the weight of the books, I went to a beer story. So what that tells you.
Love it.
Yeah. So Rick Walters. So I'm conscious of time. Is there something? Obviously, as always, listeners, there's links to Ron's book and his website and his socials in the yeah. Can you hold it to the side?
Oh, like over here.
Just hold a minute. So he's holding up a. I'm trying to do this. I'm trying to. Oh, yeah. So I'm trying to do this. Apparently, it's good for social media. It's like I saw somebody else doing it. Take a screenshot and see if I can do this. Oh, I can't remember how to do a screenshot. Oh. Okay, now I'm gonna do another one. Sorry, listener. Yeah, we got it. So it's called Spitting Image. The book, and there's links to it in the show notes. Is there something else that anything else that you'd like to share on before we bring it to?
No, I just like to encourage anyone who is interested in finding out more about their genetic identity. I'd like to encourage them not to be afraid of DNA testing. I believe one of the more popular sites that does a really good job with that in Europe is myheritage.com. Here in the US, Ancestry DNA is by far and away one of the best ones that I'm most familiar with and use a lot. But there can be a lot of fear and baggage that comes along with that when you don't know who those biological parents are. Part of that baggage we talked about, that trauma, is, will I be accepted? Should I do it? Should I not do it? Those are very personal questions. I would say my recommendation would be, if you're going to do it, go in prepared for the worst, expect the best, prepare for the worst. It'll be somewhere in between, right? But usually parents, mothers don't give up children voluntarily for very good reasons. There's usually some sort of trauma or some sort of challenge that requires that of her at the time of the decision she has to make. So don't expect it to be all great, but I can tell you that I'm very happy that I did, and that I don't regret it at all. I've made some great friends, met some fantastic new cousins, and we're family now for the rest of our lives. And it's just a blessing, and I'm glad that I did. And I hope that you all will have a lot of success with that too. And just remember, love is the way. And thank you so much for the opportunity, Simon, to talk with you today and to share.
Yeah. You're very welcome, Ron. I've loved the conversation. Right now I'm thinking what we're going to call the podcast episode. Are we going to call it Personal Transformation or Love is the Way? You've just said love is the way. Have we talked about? I don't know. Have you got a preference on that?
No. Take a look though. I'm going to send you a link to a Mandalorian video. You've got to watch the video. It's amazing. But yeah, Love is the Way is a good one.
Give the listeners the context for the Mandalorian story.
So the Mandalorian is a character in the original, or actually Boba Fett was known as Boba Fett in the first Star Wars. Right? He's a guy wearing this armor like a knight. You never see his face, and he was a bounty hunter in the original Star Wars. Right? Well, now they've got the spin-off, Star Wars spin-off, his own series called The Mandalorian. Right? And The Mandalorian is charged with returning a child to its family. Right? And so he's this intergalactic, guardian bounty hunter who finds this child who is, in fact, everyone calls it Baby Yoda. If you know Yoda from the Star Wars series, this little one that he's found and been charged to protect looks like a Baby Yoda. It's not Yoda, it's a different name, but of that species. So he's got to travel the universe, getting away from all these people who want to do damage to this last Jedi, this little Yoda. And it's not his child, but he's charged with protecting and returning. And they call this child a foundling. So those of us some who are adopted are not foundlings, but those who were left, at whether it's in a safe place or a dangerous place, abandoned, and then found, are called foundlings. And that's why my book is called The Foundling's Memoir of Faith and Gratitude, because that was my situation. I was left in hospital shortly after birth. And so this really resonates with me. But so that these bounty hunters, the Mandalorians, live by a code that they call the way. And their phrase, whenever they get ready to take on a big mission or whenever they need encouragement, they say, "This is the way." And they say it in unison, right? And it almost tears me up. It's so silly. It's Star Wars. It's, it's a fantasy thing, and I take it so seriously. It's like the best show. And I think season 3 is just starting. So if you get a chance, check that out.
Yeah. Thanks a lot, Ron. Thank you, listeners, and we'll speak to you very soon. Thank you.
Thank you all. God bless.